Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's greatest acts of spite dressed up as devotion. The woman who invented Mother's Day, the greeting cards, the brunches, the guilt trip phone calls, the carnations, spent the last decades of her life absolutely furious that any of it existed. She sued florists, she crashed conventions, she called the holiday, and I quote, a hallmark racket, and she died broke, bitter, and partially blind in a sanitarium, still fighting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Suggestions like yours are genuinely what shape this channel, and I mean that. It means everything that you take the time to share ideas. Leave a comment tonight telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always midnight somewhere, and somehow that's deeply comforting. We're also now on Spotify. The link is in the description if you'd rather fall asleep over there. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan, maybe pull a blanket up and settle in. Let's take a moment first though. Have you ever started something you immediately regretted? Have you ever looked at a project you created with love and thought, I need to destroy this? Have you ever given the world a beautiful idea only to watch capitalism turn it into a hallmark section at Walgreens? Did you know that one woman single-handedly lobbied the United States Congress, the President, and multiple governors to create a national holiday, and then spent the rest of her life trying to get it cancelled? Could you imagine loving your mother so much that you invented an entire holiday for her, and then hating what that holiday became so deeply that it consumed your entire life? Did you know she never married, never had children, and died regretting the very thing that made her famous? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1914. Mother's Day is now a federal holiday. Anna Jarvis is already starting to regret everything, and it only gets worse from here. Let's start at the beginning. In a small Methodist church in Grafton, West Virginia, sometime in the 1880s, where a little girl named Anna sat next to her mother during Sunday school and heard something that would quietly reshape American history. Her mother, Ann Reeves Jarvis, was teaching a lesson, and she closed it with a prayer, a wish, really, that someone, someday, would create a memorial for the mothers of the world. Anna heard that prayer. She filed it somewhere deep, and she never, ever let it go. Ann Reeves Jarvis was not a soft woman. She was a community organizer before the term existed, a woman who had spent the Civil War running Mother's Day work clubs, groups that nursed wounded soldiers on both sides of the conflict, without caring much for which side they had been shooting from. She believed in mothers as the moral backbone of civilization, and she raised Anna with that conviction like a second spine. Anna grew up in a house where love was expressed through action, not through softness, not through sentiment, but through showing up, doing the work, and refusing to look away from things that needed fixing. Her mother was the kind of woman who organized entire communities around problems other people had quietly agreed to ignore: infant mortality, contaminated water, the sick and the wounded. Ann Reeves Jarvis was not waiting for someone else to handle it, and Anna watched all of this from the front row of her childhood, taking detailed notes. The Jarvis family home in Grafton was not grand. West Virginia in the post-Civil War years was not a place of great material comfort for most people, and the Jarvis family was not an exception. Anna was one of 11 children, though only 4 survived to adulthood, a statistic that tells you everything you need to know about what childhood mortality looked like in that era, and probably explains some of why Anne's maternal conviction ran so deep. When you have buried 7 children, the ones who remain become the whole world, and the mothers who survive that kind of loss become, in Anna's eyes, something close to sacred. Anna was, by most accounts, a serious child, quiet, attentive, the kind of person who remembers things other people let slide. She was educated at Augusta Female Seminary in Virginia, which gave her a level of formal schooling that was relatively unusual for women of her generation and class. She had ambitions that ran beyond the domestic. She worked as a teacher. She worked in advertising briefly in Philadelphia, a genuinely unusual career choice for a woman in the 1890s. She was not someone who was going to sit quietly in a parlour and wait for her life to arrange itself around her. But underneath all of that was the mother, always the mother. Anne Reeves Jarvis loomed large in Anna's interior life in a way that is hard to fully explain unless you have had one of those relationships, the kind where a person becomes your entire reference point for what love is supposed to look like. When Anne died in 1905, something in Anna's sense of the world's order simply broke. And she did what people with her particular kind of grief tend to do. She turned it into a project. She would give her mother a memorial, not a stone in a churchyard, not a plaque on a wall, a day, a national day. Every second Sunday in May, the whole country would stop and think about their mothers. She'd heard a prayer in a Sunday school classroom decades before, and she was going to answer it herself. She could not have known what answering it would cost her. Before Anna's crusade, there was her mother's. Anne Reeves Jarvis had been running what she called Mother's Day work clubs in West Virginia since the 1850s, long before the holiday, long before the carnations, long before anyone was sending passive-aggressive texts about not calling enough. These clubs were, in the most practical sense, public health operations. West Virginia in the mid-19th century was not a place that rewarded carelessness about sanitation. Infant mortality was staggering. Contaminated milk, impure water, and untreated wounds were among the leading causes of death for both children and soldiers. Anne organised local mothers to inspect milk, treat the sick, and, in what remains one of history's quieter acts of radical decency, nurse wounded soldiers from both the Union and Confederate sides during the Civil War. Because her position was that a wounded boy was a wounded boy regardless of which flag he'd been bleeding under. To understand how unusual this was, you need to understand what the Civil War did to communities in the border states. West Virginia was new. It had only broken from Virginia in 1863, partly because the western counties did not share the eastern plantation economy's investment in secession. But families in that region were divided. Brothers were on different sides. Neighbours were enemies. The idea of a woman declaring that her medical attention did not have a political affiliation was not just logistically complicated, it was socially radical. Anne Reeves Jarvis did it anyway. The work clubs organised women around specific community problems with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not have time for abstraction. They identified contaminated water sources and agitated for cleaner supplies. They inspected the milk sold to local families and pushed back against the dealers cutting it with chalk or water or worse. Impure milk was killing children. Not metaphorically, not eventually, but directly and regularly. And Anne Reeves Jarvis had decided this was unacceptable in a way that required organisation, not just complaint. After the Civil War, Anne turned the work clubs toward reconciliation. She organised what she called Mother's Friendship Day events, gatherings designed to bring together veterans and families from both sides of the conflict, in the hope that they might remember they had once been neighbours. The idea was that mothers who had lost sons on both sides had more in common with each other than with the political machinery that had set their sons against each other. Whether this worked in any lasting way is debatable. That it was attempted, and that Anne Reeves Jarvis was the one attempting it, tells you something important about where Anna learned to believe that a single determined person could change public behaviour through sheer force of moral conviction. There is a straight line from the work clubs to the holiday. Anne Reeves Jarvis believed that organised women, acting collectively around shared values, could improve the world in measurable ways. She communicated this to Anna by example, constantly throughout Anna's childhood. The lesson took. When Anne died, Anna did not mourn passively. She organised, she wrote letters, she built a campaign. She'd been watching someone do exactly this her entire life, and she had learned it thoroughly. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that Anne's version of organised maternal action was aimed outward, at real problems in the world. Anna's was aimed inward, at a feeling she was trying to preserve. The mother had been a community organiser. The daughter became, in the end, a preservationist of something that could not be preserved. But she came by the impulse honestly. The precise moment Anna Jarvis decided to dedicate her life to honouring her mother was, by most accounts, not a dramatic one. No lightning bolt, no vision, no angel tapping her on the shoulder. It was just a Sunday school classroom in Grafton, West Virginia, and her mother finishing a lesson with a prayer that she hoped, one day, someone would establish a memorial for all mothers, living and dead, because no one had done it yet and someone really ought to. Anna was probably 9 or 10 years old. She heard her mother say this, and something inside her clicked into place with the quiet permanence of a door latch. She would be the someone. She just didn't know yet how much of her life it would cost her. The prayer itself was not a formal petition. It was more of a wistful aside, the kind of thing a person says at the end of a long lesson, when their mind wanders briefly into something personal. Anne Reeves Jarvis had been thinking about this for a while. She had watched mothers nurse the sick, bury their children, hold communities together through war and poverty and disease, and she had noticed that there was no particular day when any of this was formally acknowledged. There was no monument to ordinary maternal endurance. There was no occasion when the culture paused and said, "We see you. This matters. Thank you." To Anne, this was an oversight worth correcting. She said so, quietly, at the end of a Sunday school lesson, and her daughter, sitting in the 3rd row or the 5th row or wherever small determined girls sat in West Virginia Sunday school rooms in the 1880s, heard her. What Anna did with that hearing is worth thinking about. She did not go home and immediately write to Congress. She was 9 years old. But she held it. The way certain things said by certain people stay with you not because they were said loudly or with emphasis, but because they were said by someone whose voice you have organised your whole interior world around. If your mother tells you something matters, it tends to matter. If your mother tells you something is missing from the world, you notice the absence. Anna carried the prayer through her teenage years, through her education at Augusta Female Seminary, through her brief teaching career, through her move to Philadelphia and her work in advertising. She carried it through the years of caring for her mother as Anne's health declined. And when Anne Reeves Jarvis died on the 2nd Sunday of May in 1905, Anna had been carrying the prayer for roughly 25 years. She gave herself 2 years to grieve. Then she started writing letters. The first letters went to ministers, asking them to hold memorial services for mothers in their churches, then to politicians, asking for official support, then to newspapers asking for coverage, then to businessmen asking for financial backing. The campaign built slowly, then quickly, the way these things do when the right person has the right combination of conviction, energy, and absolutely nothing else competing for their attention. She had heard one prayer in one Sunday school classroom one afternoon in Grafton. She was going to answer it if it took the rest of her life. It did. Anne Reeves Jarvis died on the 2nd Sunday of May in 1905. Anna was 39 years old, unmarried, living with her mother, and by most contemporary accounts, devastated in the particular way of people whose entire emotional world has been organised around one person. She'd spent years caring for her mother, managing her affairs, attending to her health, and the sudden absence was not something Anna pivoted away from gracefully. She leaned into it. 2 years after her mother's death, Anna began writing letters, hundreds of them, to politicians, ministers, businessmen, newspaper editors, and anyone else she could think of who might help her create an official day of recognition for all mothers. The letters were passionate. They were also relentless. Anna Jarvis in full epistolary mode was apparently not someone you could simply ignore. Anne's death had come after a period of declining health, which meant Anna had watched it approaching. There is a particular exhaustion in that kind of grief, the long vigil, the gradual diminishment of someone who had been enormous in your life, the strange suspended state of waiting for a loss you can already see clearly and cannot stop. Anna had been her mother's primary caretaker. When Anne died, Anna had not just lost a person. She'd lost the structure around which her daily life had been organised, the purpose that had given her mornings their shape. What she did with that emptiness is telling. Another person might have found a new routine, a new relationship, a new project unrelated to loss. Anna found a way to make the loss itself the project. She would create a day, every year, on the anniversary of her mother's death, the second Sunday of May. The country would stop and remember. Not Anne Reeves Jarvis specifically, not at first, but all mothers. Every mother who had done what Anne had done, held things together, nursed the sick, buried children, gotten up the next morning anyway. The letter-writing campaign that began in 1907 was not modest in its ambitions. Anna wrote to the governors of every state. She wrote to senators and representatives. She wrote to cabinet members and to the Postmaster General. She wrote to ministers of every denomination she could identify. She wrote to prominent businessmen. She wrote to newspaper editors with the frequency of someone who had mistaken them for pen pals. The letters were articulate, impassioned, and detailed. She had thought through the arguments. She had considered the objections. She had a vision, and she was going to communicate it until someone did something about it. Some recipients ignored her. Some wrote back with polite non-committal encouragement. Some actually helped. Ministers began incorporating mother-focused services into their programming. State legislators introduced resolutions. The idea began to spread, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulated weight of consistent, relentless, tireless pressure applied by one woman with a typewriter and a grief that had nowhere else to go. She funded much of this herself. The postage alone was significant. The time was total. Anna had no competing obligations, no husband, no children, no career she was trying to maintain alongside the campaign. She had given herself entirely to this, the way people sometimes give themselves to causes after losses, when ordinary life no longer seems to hold together on its own. Her mother had told her, once, that someone should do this. The someone was Anna. She had always known it would be. The first official Mother's Day service was held on May 10th, 1908, at the Andrews Methodist Episcopal Church in Grafton, West Virginia, the same church where Anne Reeves Jarvis had once taught Sunday school. Anna organised it, paid for it, and sent 500 white carnations to be distributed to the congregation, because white carnations had been her mother's favourite flower, and Anna was the kind of person who committed to a symbol. She wasn't in Grafton herself that day. She was in Philadelphia, holding a simultaneous service at a department store auditorium there, which in retrospect is the kind of detail that should have told her something about where all of this was heading. The services were a success. Newspapers covered them warmly. People wept. Anna Jarvis was already writing more letters. The choice of the Andrews Methodist Church was deliberate and personal. This was not simply a convenient venue. It was the specific church where Anne Reeves Jarvis had run her Sunday school classes, where she had taught the lessons that Anna had grown up sitting through, where she had delivered the prayer that had set all of this in motion roughly 20 years before. Anna wanted the first service held there because the whole point was specificity. A particular woman, a particular memory, a particular love. The church was not a symbol. It was the actual place. The 500 white carnations were also specific. Anna Jarvis had loved white carnations. Anna had not chosen them because they were cheap or widely available, or because some floral industry consultant had told her they photographed well. She had chosen them because they were her mother's flower. She sent them to Grafton to be distributed to congregation members with instructions that white carnations were to signify a mother who had died, and red carnations a mother who was still living. She wanted people to wear them. She wanted the physical presence of the symbol, pinned to a coat, visible, personal, not the purchasing of it. The Philadelphia service, held simultaneously at the Wanamaker department store auditorium, drew a larger crowd and broader press coverage, which was useful for the campaign but slightly uncomfortable in retrospect. John Wanamaker was a prominent Philadelphia businessman and a supporter of the Mother's Day effort, and his willingness to host the service provided both a large venue and implicit commercial endorsement. The auditorium could hold thousands. It was not a Sunday school classroom in West Virginia. Anna was already in the service of spreading her message using the infrastructure of commerce. She would spend the next 40 years regretting this. The coverage was everything she could have hoped for. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the Grafton service, about the carnations, about Anna's campaign and her mother's legacy. The Associated Press picked it up. Editors who'd been receiving Anna's letters for a year now had an actual event to write about. The response from readers was warm and immediate. Letters to the editor, expressions of support, people writing in to say that yes, they had always felt there should be something like this, that their own mothers deserved acknowledgement, that the idea was right, and the time was now. Anna read all of it. She wrote back to much of it. She had proven the concept. Now she needed the government. She started writing more letters, different recipients this time, state legislators, governors, congressional representatives. She had a service. She had press coverage. She had demonstrated public interest. She needed official recognition. She'd been doing this for less than a year, and she had already cleared the first 3 obstacles. Nobody was going to stop her. Not yet. What Anna Jarvis lacked in institutional power, she made up for in sheer written volume. Between 1908 and 1914, she wrote to the governors of every state, members of Congress, cabinet secretaries, newspaper editors, and prominent businessmen, asking, sometimes demanding, that they support a national Mother's Day holiday. She funded this campaign largely out of her own pocket, eventually spending much of the inheritance she and her sister Elsinore had received. Her letters were not polite requests. They were organised arguments with emotional force behind them, the correspondence of someone who decided this was her life's work and was not interested in obstacles. Several states adopted unofficial Mother's Day observances in the early 1910s. Anna kept writing. She wanted federal. To appreciate the scale of the letter-writing campaign, you need to think about what it meant to write letters in the early 20th century. There was no email. There was no word processor. There were no templates you could quickly customize and send in batches. Every letter Anna wrote was either handwritten or typed on a typewriter, one at a time, addressed individually, stamped individually, and posted individually. She wrote hundreds of them. Some accounts suggest thousands over the full course of the campaign. She kept records. She followed up. She wrote again when people did not respond, and then wrote again after that. This was not the behaviour of someone with a hobby. This was the behaviour of someone with a vocation. Anna had organised her entire existence around this campaign in the way that people sometimes do when grief and purpose become the same thing. She had no competing demands on her time that she considered equally important. She got up in the morning and she wrote letters. She did this for 6 years before Wilson signed the proclamation. The argument she made shifted depending on the recipient. To ministers, she appealed to spiritual obligation, the church's responsibility to honour the family unit, the moral necessity of acknowledging maternal sacrifice. To politicians, she appealed to civic values, the role of mothers in shaping citizens, the patriotic duty of recognising the people who produced the nation's workforce and soldiers. To businessmen, she made more practical cases, the value of community, morale, the social benefit of shared ritual. She was not a single-note campaigner. She read her audience and adjusted her emphasis, while keeping the core argument consistent. She also cultivated allies strategically. She wrote to prominent women's organisations. She wrote to veterans groups who remembered the work Anna Jarvis had done during the Civil War. She wrote to ministers who had already incorporated mother-focused sermons into their programming and asked them to write to their own representatives in support of the holiday. She was building a network, one letter at a time, out of her Philadelphia house. The states fell first. West Virginia adopted a Mother's Day observance in 1910. Washington, Oklahoma, and others followed within a year or two. By 1912, nearly every state had some form of unofficial recognition. This gave Anna the evidence she needed for the federal push, not just sentiment, but demonstrated public uptake. Governors on the record, ministers on board, a country that had already been practicing the holiday informally and was ready to be told it was official. She kept writing anyway. The federal resolution still needed votes. There were still people in Congress who had not yet heard from Anna Jarvis. She was working on correcting that situation. On May 8, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed a resolution designating the second Sunday in May as Mother's Day, a national day of observance honouring the mothers of the nation. Anna Jarvis had done it. She had started from a Sunday school prayer, written what must have amounted to thousands of letters, spent years campaigning, and won. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement for a private citizen with no political office, no organisational backing, and no particular wealth beyond what she'd inherited and subsequently spent on the campaign itself. She was 48 years old, she had no husband, she had no children. She'd given everything she had to a holiday in her mother's memory. And then, almost immediately, she began to realise what she'd actually created, and she did not like it one bit. The resolution passed the Senate unanimously. The House had passed its version unanimously as well. This was, in 1914, one of those rare issues on which there was no political daylight. Nobody in Congress was going to go on record against mothers. Wilson signed it at a ceremony that received warm press coverage. Anna Jarvis was recognised as the holiday's founder. Her mother's name was mentioned. The white carnation was invoked. It was, by all external appearances, a triumph. Anna had achieved in 6 years what most private citizens never achieve in a lifetime, a specific legislative outcome at the federal level, driven entirely by personal conviction and written correspondence. No lobbyist, no organisation, no money except her own, no staff except herself and occasionally Elsinore. She'd written the letters, followed up on the letters, travelled to meetings, organised the services, cultivated the allies, and won. It was remarkable. Wilson himself was apparently genuinely moved by the concept, or at least had the political wisdom to appear so. The proclamation's language was warm and specific about the value of maternal sacrifice to the national character. Anna had given the speechwriters good material. She had been making the same arguments eloquently for 6 years. But here is what Anna did not fully anticipate, or perhaps anticipated and dismissed as manageable. The federal recognition did not make the holiday more personal. It made it more visible. And visibility, in a modern commercial economy, has consequences. The newspapers ran the story. The magazines picked it up. The department stores and florists and candy manufacturers read the coverage with the particular attention of people who recognise a business opportunity when the federal government has just confirmed it exists. Within days of Wilson's signature, florists were advertising Mother's Day specials. Card companies were already printing for the following May. Department stores began planning promotions. The holiday had been official for approximately 72 hours, and the commercial infrastructure was already organising around it with a speed and enthusiasm that Anna had not considered. She had spent 6 years imagining what would happen after she won. She had imagined services in churches, personal letters written by hand, white carnations worn as private emblems of love and remembrance. She had not imagined the Mother's Day sale at Wanamaker's. She had not imagined the carnation being sold by the gross at markup. She found out quickly, and within a year or two of the signing, Anna Jarvis was already publicly complaining about what commerce had done to her holiday. Within a decade, she would be at war with the industries that had monetized it. The woman who had spent 6 years writing letters to create a holiday would spend the next 30 writing letters to destroy one. She had won. It was the beginning of losing everything. The ink on Wilson's proclamation was not yet dry before the floral industry had an opinion about Mother's Day. Florists, candy makers, greeting card companies, and department stores looked at a federally recognised holiday centred on expressions of love for mothers and saw something Anna Jarvis had not intended: an annual guaranteed revenue event. Flower prices went up around Mother's Day almost immediately. Carnations, Anna's chosen symbol, meant to be modest and heartfelt, became a seasonal commodity. Greeting card companies began churning out Mother's Day cards by the millions, reducing what Anna had conceived as a day of personal, handwritten tribute into a retail transaction. She had specified, repeatedly, that the apostrophe in Mother's Day should be singular. It was your Mother's Day, personal, intimate, not a collective commercial holiday. The greeting card version was already using the plural. Anna noticed all of this with rising horror. To understand why this bothered Anna so specifically and so deeply, you need to understand what she had actually been proposing. When Anna talked about how she wanted people to observe Mother's Day, she was precise. Not a purchased card, a letter written by hand by you, in your own words, describing what your mother had meant to you. Not a box of chocolates selected from a display, a personal act. Not flowers bought from a florist and delivered by a stranger, the white carnation worn on your own coat as a private emblem. She had a vision of the holiday that was fundamentally about the specificity of the relationship between you and your mother, and fundamentally incompatible with scalable commerce. The floral industry, operating from an entirely different set of assumptions, looked at this vision and saw a cut flower opportunity of extraordinary scale. Think about the math. Every adult in the country with a living mother purchasing flowers once a year on the same weekend. The carnation, newly identified as the official Mother's Day flower by the holiday's own founder, was particularly well positioned. Florists began stocking heavily for May. Prices rose to meet demand. What Anna had chosen as a modest, meaningful personal symbol was transformed within a few years into a seasonal commodity with a printed price tag. The greeting card companies were equally fast. The sentiment behind Mother's Day, love, gratitude, acknowledgement, the wish to say something true about what a person had meant to you, was, it turned out, exactly the kind of sentiment that a printed card could approximate at scale for a few cents per unit. Hallmark and its competitors began producing Mother's Day cards almost immediately after the holiday's recognition. They were, by most accounts, genuinely popular. People bought them because they wanted to say something to their mothers, and the card said something that felt adequate, and it was easier than writing a letter. This is precisely what Anna could not forgive. The card was adequate. inadequacy was the problem. A purchased approximation of feeling selected from a rack, signed with your name, mailed in an envelope, this was not what she had intended. She had intended the real thing. The inadequate substitute was, in her view, not a gesture toward the real thing. It was a replacement of it, a way of feeling like you had done something without actually doing anything. She said all of this, loudly, in letters and interviews. She called the card companies charlatans. She told newspapers that a card was a poor excuse for the letter. You're too lazy or too indifferent to write. She was not subtle. She was not diplomatic. She was furious, and she wanted everyone to know it. The card companies kept printing, the florists kept selling, the customers kept buying, and Anna Jarvis began the long, expensive, ultimately unsuccessful campaign to take back what she had made. Anna Jarvis did not suffer commercialization quietly. By the early 1920s, she had declared open war on what she called the charlatans, bandits, pirates, racketeers, kidnappers and termites who had stolen her holiday, and yes, she actually used those words in writing, addressed to real people and organizations. She showed up at a convention of the confectionery industry and disrupted it. She crashed a meeting of American war mothers who were selling carnations as a fundraiser and had to be removed by police. She picketed businesses. She filed multiple lawsuits, many of them at her own expense, against organizations using the Mother's Day name for commercial purposes. Her legal fees were significant. Her savings were dwindling. Her grievances were genuine, deeply felt, and, it has to be said, increasingly hard to act on given that the entire commercial apparatus of American retail had no intention of giving up Mother's Day. The arrest at the American War Mothers meeting deserves particular attention because it illustrates something important about Anna's campaign that is easy to miss. She was not opposed to honouring mothers in principle. She was not opposed to the American War Mothers as an organisation. What she was opposed to was the use of carnations, her symbol, chosen by her for her mother as a commercial fundraising mechanism. The War Mothers were selling carnations at their meetings to raise money for their charitable work. This was, by any ordinary standard, a benign and even admirable activity. Anna found it intolerable. The carnation was not for selling. It was for wearing. It meant something specific. Turning it into a fundraising product was, in her view, exactly the kind of commodification she'd been fighting since 1915. She said so, at volume, in the middle of the meeting. She had to be removed by police. She was in her 50s at the time. This incident is sometimes presented as evidence that Anna had become unhinged, that her grief had curdled into something irrational. But there is another way to read it. She had created a symbol with a specific meaning, embedded in a specific history, tied to a specific woman she had loved, and she was watching that symbol being picked up, detached from its history, sold for 50 cents, and pinned to lapels by people who had no idea it had ever meant anything personal. That experience of watching something you made with love become a product is genuinely painful. Anna's response to the pain was perhaps disproportionate, but the pain itself was real. The lawsuits were a different matter. Anna filed multiple legal actions against organizations she believed were using the Mother's Day name or the carnation symbolism without authorization. In commercial contexts she found objectionable. Most of these suits went nowhere. She had created a holiday that had been written into federal law, which meant, among other things, that it was now a public institution, not a personal property. You cannot sue the greeting card industry for selling cards about a federally recognized holiday. The legal system was not sympathetic. Each failed lawsuit cost money she increasingly could not afford. Each confrontation at an industry meeting or convention cost her credibility with the press, which had been initially supportive and was now beginning to describe her as a figure of pathos rather than principle. She was aware of this shift and found it infuriating. She was not a figure of pathos. She was right. She kept going anyway. Being right and being effective are different skills, and Anna had only ever developed one of them. Here's the thing about Anna Jarvis that gets lost in the story of her crusade against greeting cards. She was grieving, genuinely, profoundly, permanently. The holiday had never really been about creating a civic institution. It was about her mother, about Anne Reeves Jarvis specifically, her particular face and voice and the Sunday school prayer and the white carnations. Anna had tried to give the entire country a way to feel what she felt about her own mother, and instead the country had taken the form of it, the flowers, the card, the second Sunday in May, and emptied out all of the specific, irreplaceable feelings she had put inside it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a particular kind of grief that most people have felt in smaller versions. The thing you made for someone specific, turned into a product, stripped of meaning, sold back to you. Anne Reeves Jarvis died in 1905. Anna never fully stopped mourning her. This is not a clinical diagnosis. Anna was not, by most accounts, unable to function. She worked, she corresponded, she campaigned, she organised. But there is a quality to the campaign that suggests it was not just advocacy. It was continuation. As long as Anna was fighting for Mother's Day, fighting to create it, and then fighting to save it from what it had become, she was still in some sense doing something for her mother. She was still in relationship with Anne. The campaign was the relationship, the only form it could take after death. This is worth sitting with, because it changes how the later years read. When Anna showed up at an industry convention and had to be removed by police, she was not simply a cranky reformer who disagreed with retail practice. She was a daughter who had spent 40 years trying to keep something of her mother alive, and she was watching it be disassembled and sold for parts. The anger was real. The grief underneath it was older and deeper than any commercial dispute. She had no children of her own to pour that love into. She had no husband. She had had Elsinore, and she had had the campaign. When Elsinore's health began to decline, Anna cared for her as she had cared for Anne, with total, undivided, unsentimental devotion. When the campaign seemed lost, she kept fighting it as if losing was simply not an option she was willing to consider. These are the behaviours of someone whose love has very limited outlets, and has therefore concentrated itself to an extreme pressure in the ones that remain. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, and Anna probably would not, is that the holiday itself had become one of those outlets. She had made it in love. She could not stop caring about what happened to it. And what happened to it commercially was exactly the kind of reduction of the specific to the generic, the personal to the mass-produced, that grief cannot tolerate. Grief needs the specific. It needs the particular face, the particular voice, the particular flower that meant something to a particular person. It cannot survive being averaged into a display at a pharmacy. Anna Jarvis spent 30 years trying to prevent a holiday from becoming a display at a pharmacy. She did not succeed. But the fighting of it was, in some important and irreducible way, the closest she could get to still loving her mother out loud. You can't make that into a greeting card. She was right about that, at least. Anna did not fight alone, at least not at first. Her sister Elsinore had inherited the same resources, the same family love, and a significant portion of the same stubbornness. The two of them funded the early Mother's Day campaign together and lived together in Philadelphia for much of their adult lives. Two unmarried sisters in a shared house built around shared purpose. When their money began to run out, and it did run out steadily, through years of legal fees and letter-writing campaigns and personal crusades against candy manufacturers, Elsinore's health declined. Anna cared for her. This was a pattern Anna knew well, having cared for her own mother at the end. She was, in some ways, a woman constitutionally suited to devotion and constitutionally unsuited to anything else. The caring was not a burden to her. The losing of the people she cared for was. Anna Jarvis is one of history's more under-examined figures, which is a polite way of saying she's been almost entirely absorbed into her sister's story and barely appears in her own right. What we know is modest. She shared the Philadelphia household with Anna for decades. She contributed to the early campaign financially, and she was by all accounts a quieter, less publicly combative version of the same essential person. Where Anna went to conventions and got arrested, Elsinore stayed home. Where Anna wrote furious letters to industry associations, Elsinore appears to have kept the household functioning. They were, in the way of sisters who have lived together long enough, probably each other's most constant and most exhausting relationship. The money they shared came primarily from the estate of their father, Granville Jarvis, who had been a reasonably successful businessman. It was not a fortune by any grand measure, but it was enough initially to fund the letter-writing campaign, the postage, the travel, the legal consultations and the various organising efforts that the Mother's Day crusade required. Anna spent it with the focused intensity of someone who had decided the money was for this and nothing else was as important. Elsinore's declining health in the later years of their shared life added another layer of complexity to Anna's already complicated situation. She was now simultaneously running a campaign, funding it from dwindling resources, and caring for a sister who needed increasing amounts of attention and medical expense. This is not an unfamiliar position for unmarried women of that era. The ones who stayed home, who didn't marry, who were available when the family needed caretaking because they had no competing household to manage. Anna had done it for her mother. She was doing it again for Elsinore. There is something quietly exhausting about this pattern, even at a distance of 100 years. Anna gave everything to the people she loved, and the people she loved one by one required everything she had. Her mother, her sister, her holiday. Each of these things consumed her in sequence, and none of them gave back what she put in, not because they were ungrateful, but because that is what total devotion tends to produce. You pour everything into something, and the something still ends. The mother died. The sister declined. The holiday was taken over by florists, and still Anna kept going. She cared for Elsinore with the same thoroughness she'd brought to caring for Anne, the same refusal to do anything halfway. When Elsinore died, Anna was more alone than she'd been at any point in her adult life. The campaign was still running, the letters were still going out, but the house in Philadelphia was very quiet, and the person who had been there through all of it was gone. Anna kept writing letters. It was the only thing she knew how to do with loss. By the 1930s, Anna Jarvis was in her 60s living in Philadelphia, increasingly frail, increasingly broke and still fighting. She had by this point sent so many letters of protest to so many organisations that her correspondence had become, in certain circles, something of a known quantity. The kind of letter you received, acknowledged respectfully, and then did nothing about. Her financial situation had deteriorated significantly. The inheritance she and Elsinore had shared was largely gone, spent on the decades-long campaign to either control or dismantle the commercial holiday she'd created. She had no pension, no savings to speak of, and no income beyond what relatives occasionally provided. She was not unknown. Newspapers still ran stories about her, but she was, in practical terms, running out of resources and running out of time. Philadelphia had been Anna's home since the 1890s, when she had moved there to work and build something of an independent life. The city suited her in certain ways. It was large enough to be anonymous when she wanted to be, connected enough to the national press to be useful when she wanted coverage, and close enough to Washington that she could make the trip to lobby Congress without it being an expedition. She'd lived there through the campaign's long arc, the hopeful years of letter writing, the triumphant year of the proclamation, the increasingly bitter years of fighting commerce, and now the quieter, harder years of watching the fight slip away. The house on North Sydenham Street where she lived in her later years was modest. She'd sold or spent most of what she had. She was not eating well by some accounts. She was not well cared for in any practical sense because she had never organised her life around being cared for. She had organised it around doing the caring, and now there was no one left to receive it. Her eyesight was beginning to fail. Her hearing was going. She was writing fewer letters, partly because she could see the paper less clearly and partly because she was beginning to understand, with the reluctant clarity that comes late in long campaigns, that the letters were not working. Journalists still came to interview her. She was good copy, the founder of Mother's Day, spending her old age trying to cancel it, living on almost nothing in a small Philadelphia house, while greeting card companies made millions. The irony was too clean for newspapers to ignore. Anna gave the interviews. She made the same arguments she had always made. She was not confused about her, positioned, or fuzzy about the details. She knew exactly what she believed and exactly why, and she communicated it clearly to anyone who asked. What she could not communicate, because it was not the kind of thing that fits into a newspaper interview, was the full weight of what those decades had cost. She had given her inheritance to the campaign. She had given her youth and her middle age to the letter writing. She had given up whatever alternative life she might have built, the relationships, the security, the ordinary pleasures of a life not organised entirely around a single cause. She had done all of this for her mother, for the specific grief of a specific loss, and the world had taken what she built and turned it into a Wanamaker's sale event. She sat in her Philadelphia house in the 1930s and wrote letters that nobody acted on, to organisations that found her tiresome, about a holiday that had long since stopped belonging to her. And she kept going, because what else do you do when the thing you spent your life on is all you have left? Anna Jarvis's vision of Mother's Day was, when she articulated it clearly, achingly specific. She wanted people to write a personal letter to their mothers, not a purchased card, a letter in their own handwriting, describing what their mother had meant to them. She wanted people to visit their mothers if possible, or to attend church services in their memory if their mothers had died. She wanted the white carnation worn as a personal emblem, not sold by the bushel. She wanted, in other words, the private and irreplaceable version of love, the kind that doesn't scale, can't be manufactured, and resists being turned into a display at a pharmacy checkout counter. The fact that America looked at this vision and responded by inventing the Mother's Day brunch industry was, to Anna, not a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal. She was specific about the letter because the letter was the point. Anna believed, and she was not wrong about this, that the act of sitting down and finding words for what someone has meant to you is itself a form of love. It requires tension. It requires honesty. It forces you to be specific about a person rather than general about a sentiment. You cannot write a genuine personal letter to your mother by selecting from a menu of pre-printed options. You have to think about her. You have to decide what is true. That process of deciding, Anna believed, was the whole thing. The card skipped the process and delivered only the result, and a pre-packaged result at that, written by a stranger in a card company office who had never met your mother and was trying to write something acceptable to the largest possible number of people simultaneously. The handwritten letter, by contrast, was yours. It was specific to your mother and to your relationship with her, which no one else had and no one else could describe. Anna had written such letters herself. She understood what they cost. The sitting down, the false starts, the discomfort of trying to say something true about love without sounding either maudlin or inadequate. She also understood what they gave: a record, a document, something a mother could keep and reread and hold. Something that said, "I thought about you specifically. I chose these words for you." The visited church service mattered for similar reasons. Anna had organised the first Mother's Day around church services deliberately, because the church was where her mother had taught and prayed and done the work of her community life. A church service was a communal act of specific acknowledgement. We are gathered here, together, to remember people who mattered. It had gravity. It had intentionality. It was not a transaction. She had nothing against flowers as flowers. She had chosen the carnation herself, and she meant it as a symbol, not a commodity. Wearing a white carnation to indicate that your mother had died, or a red one to indicate she was living, that was a personal act with personal meaning. You were declaring something about your own life, your own loss or fortune, in a public but private way. The carnation on the lapel said, "I am thinking about my mother today." It did not say, "I purchased this on the way over." What Anna wanted, reduced to its simplest form, was for people to mean it. To actually think about their mothers, specifically and honestly, rather than gesturing in the direction of maternal appreciation via a commercial product and calling it done. This is not an unreasonable thing to want. It is also, it turns out, not something you can legislate, mandate, or protect from the greeting card industry. Meaning is exactly what scales worst. Hallmark, founded in 1910, had been selling Mother's Day cards almost since Anna created the holiday. By the time Anna began her loudest campaigns against commercial observance, the greeting card industry was not particularly concerned. Company representatives occasionally issued polite statements about honouring the spirit of the holiday while acknowledging the role of commerce in modern life, which is a very diplomatic way of saying they had absolutely no intention of stopping. The floral industry, similarly, pointed out that flowers were a traditional expression of love, that Anna herself had distributed carnations at the first service, and that they were simply meeting consumer demand. These were not unreasonable arguments. They were also, to Anna, completely beside the point. She had not created a demand-side sentiment marketplace. She had made something specific and personal, and the market had taken it. The greeting card industry's position, when pressed, was essentially this. People want to express love to their mothers. We make products that help them do that. The holiday exists because people feel something real, and our cards are a vehicle for communicating that feeling. What exactly is the objection? This argument was effective because it was not entirely wrong. People did feel something real. Cards did allow them to communicate it, approximately, in a form that was convenient and accessible. The industry was not manufacturing sentiment out of nothing. It was packaging something genuine into a product, and people were buying the product because the underlying feeling was real. Anna's objection was to the packaging, and specifically to the way the packaging replaced the original. A greeting card is not a letter. It is a gesture toward the idea of a letter, produced industrially, selected rather than written, signed rather than composed. It says, "I thought of you enough to stop at a store." It does not say, "I thought about you specifically, chose these particular words because they are true of you, and not of anyone else's mother," and sat with the discomfort of trying to articulate something real. Anna believed these were different things. The industry believed they were close enough. Joyce Hall, the founder of Hallmark, was by all accounts a genuinely thoughtful businessman who believed his cards served a real human need. He argued that not everyone could find the words, that many people felt genuine love but lacked the facility to express it in writing, and that a well-made card helped them say something true that they could not have said themselves. This is a reasonable defense. It is also, almost perfectly, the opposite of what Anna Jarvis believed mattered about the exercise. The candy manufacturers took a similar line. Chocolate was a traditional gift of affection. Women liked chocolate. Giving your mother chocolate on Mother's Day was an expression of care and consideration. The fact that it was commercially produced and seasonally promoted did not negate the warmth behind it. They were not wrong that warmth existed. They were describing a different thing than Anna was describing, and both of them knew it. What the commercial interests had correctly identified, and what Anna had not fully accounted for, was that most people find the personal letter genuinely hard. Not impossible, not unwelcome, but hard. It requires a kind of emotional directness that many people spend their whole lives successfully avoiding. The card was easier. The flowers were easier. Easier things get done more often than harder ones. The industry had not stolen Anna's holiday. It had offered the country a lower friction version of it, and the country had accepted. Anna found this unforgivable. The country found it convenient. Both of them were still finding the second Sunday in May on their calendars every year, which was something. In one of history's more striking reversals of ambition, Anna Jarvis eventually began petitioning the United States government to cancel Mother's Day entirely, the same government she had spent years petitioning to create it. She wrote to Congress, she wrote to the White House, she argued that the holiday had been so thoroughly corrupted by commercialism that it no longer served its intended purpose and should be abolished before it caused further damage to the genuine institution of motherhood, which in her view was being cheapened by association with candy boxes and printed sentiments. Congress was not, it should be noted, particularly responsive to this request. Mother's Day by the 1940s was one of the most commercially significant holidays in the American retail calendar. The idea of cancelling it had approximately zero political constituency. To fully appreciate the audacity of this position, consider what it would require politically. Anna was asking elected officials to vote against Mother's Day. She was asking them to go on record as the person who cancelled the holiday honouring mothers, in a country that had made maternal reverence into something approaching civic religion, in a period when wartime sentiment had elevated the figure of the grieving mother to near sacred status. The Gold Star mothers, the boys overseas writing home. The entire emotional architecture of American wartime identity was built on the foundation of maternal love and sacrifice, and Anna Jarvis wanted Congress to vote to abolish the holiday. She was not confused about the difficulty of this. She was beyond caring about the difficulty. She'd spent 30 years watching her holiday be taken from her in slow motion, sold off piece by piece to florists and candy makers and greeting card companies, stripped of everything she had put into it, and she had reached the point where she would rather have nothing than have this. If the choice was between a genuine memorial to mothers and a retail event with greeting cards, she preferred no holiday at all. She made the argument in letters that were, by this point, the correspondence of someone who knows she is losing, but has decided that losing loudly is better than conceding quietly. She wrote to congressmen who were almost certainly not going to act. She wrote to the White House during administrations that had more pressing matters. She wrote to newspapers that ran the letters as curiosities rather than serious policy proposals. She was aware of how this looked. She wrote the letters anyway. There is something almost admirable in this stubbornness, stripped of any expectation that it would work. Anna was not writing to Congress because she thought Congress would listen. She was writing because she believed she was right, and being right meant saying so, regardless of audience or outcome. This is the behaviour of someone who has made peace with being ineffective but has not made peace with being silent. She would register her objection for the record. The record would ignore her objection. She would register it again. The government did not cancel Mother's Day. It has not cancelled Mother's Day. Mother's Day remains, as of this recording, one of the highest revenue retail weekends in the American calendar. Restaurants are fully booked, flower prices are elevated, greeting card sections in pharmacies are restocked in early April. The holiday Anna spent 30 years trying to dismantle continues to operate at full commercial capacity every second Sunday of May. She would be furious about this. She would also not be surprised. There is something quietly poignant about the fact that Anna Jarvis, who devoted her life to celebrating motherhood, never had children. She never married. She had, by most accounts, one significant romantic relationship in her youth that did not proceed to marriage, and after that she seems to have directed all of her considerable emotional intensity toward her mother, her sister, and eventually the holiday itself. She's reported to have said, late in life, that she was glad she had no children given what she had seen of the world, which reads either as genuine conviction or as the kind of thing you say when something has cost you enough that you need to believe it was worth the price. She was not bitter about childlessness in any straightforward way. She was bitter about the holiday. Those were different griefs. The young man she'd been involved with, the relationship that did not lead to marriage, is one of history's hazier figures. There is not enough in the historical record to say with confidence who he was, what the relationship was, or why it ended. What seems clear is that it ended, that Anna did not pursue other relationships after it did, and that she subsequently organised her emotional life around her family of origin rather than building a new one. Whether this was a choice, a circumstance, or something in between is not something the record resolves. What is worth sitting with is the particular shape of the life she built. Anna Jarvis was, by any ordinary measure, a person of enormous capacity for love. The holiday she created was not a political act or an intellectual exercise. It was love, specific, overwhelming love for a specific person that had nowhere to go after the person died and so became a campaign. The intensity she brought to the letter writing, the lawsuits, the convention disruptions, the petitions to Congress, this was not the energy of a reformer with a policy agenda. This was the energy of someone who loved very much and was trying, desperately and unsuccessfully, to preserve what they had loved in a form that the world had no interest in preserving. She was also, without children of her own, somewhat outside the experience she was advocating for. She knew motherhood from the receiving end, as a daughter, as someone who had been loved and shaped by Anne Reeves Jarvis's particular version of maternal devotion. She did not know it from the giving end. This gave her a kind of clarity about what mattered in the relationship because she'd only ever inhabited one side of it. Her mother's love had been the organising fact of her life. She wanted the whole country to stop once a year and acknowledge what that meant. What she could not fully account for, perhaps, was that the receiving end and the giving end of maternal love are different experiences, and the holiday she created served both. Mothers wanted acknowledgement. Children, adult ones, obligated ones, guilty ones, loving ones, wanted a mechanism for expressing what was often difficult to say directly. The commercial holiday, for all its inadequacies, was doing something real for both groups. Anna had designed it for daughters who loved their mothers the way she loved hers. The country had repurposed it into something more complicated and more general. She had no children. She never had to be thanked on Mother's Day. She never had to sit at a restaurant and receive a card from an adult child who had left it to the last minute. She never experienced the holiday from the other side, the imperfect, grateful side, the better-than-nothing side. Perhaps if she had, she would have understood why the card, inadequate as it was, still meant something to the person who sent it, and the person who received it. Perhaps not. Anna Jarvis was not, by disposition, someone who found better than nothing sufficient. Throughout the 1920s, 30s and 40s, Anna Jarvis was a reliable source of newspaper copy. She gave interviews, she sent letters to editors, she issued statements denouncing florists. She was, by the standards of the era, a somewhat unusual public figure, an elderly unmarried woman with a single consuming obsession, declining finances, and no apparent interest in moderating her positions for palatability. Reporters tended to treat her with a mixture of affection and gentle condescension, the tone one reserves for someone whose passion is clearly genuine and whose cause is clearly lost. She kept talking anyway. She had been talking for 40 years. She was not going to stop because a few journalists found her quixotic. The newspaper coverage of Anna Jarvis across those decades tells its own story, and it is not an entirely flattering one, not because the reporters were cruel, but because the tone shifted in ways that reveal how the culture had absorbed and then outgrown her. In the early years, after 1908 and through the federal recognition in 1914, the coverage was warm and celebratory. Here was the woman who created Mother's Day. Here is her story, here is her mother, here are the white carnations, here is the service in Grafton. It was human interest at its most straightforward. By the 1920s, the coverage had acquired a slight edge of bemusement. Here is the woman who created Mother's Day, fighting against the holiday she created. Isn't that something? The pieces were still sympathetic. Journalists generally found Anna likeable, or at least interesting. But there was a quality of mild bewilderment, as if the reporters could not quite understand why she didn't simply accept her success and enjoy it. She had created a national holiday. Most people would consider that a satisfactory life's work. The fact that she was now suing carnation sellers was, from this angle, eccentric at best. By the 1930s, the coverage had settled into something closer to elegy. The stories about Anna in this period have a particular quality, respectful, slightly sad, written about someone the journalist considers essentially defeated but not without dignity. She was in her 60s and 70s by then, visibly older, living more modestly, still fighting the same battles that she'd been fighting since the 19-teens. The reporters wrote about her as a woman who had been right about something and had paid for being right with everything she had. This was not entirely inaccurate. What the coverage never fully captured was the consistency of her thinking. Anna was not, across those decades, a person whose positions became more confused or more extreme with age. She believed the same things in 1940 that she had believed in 1915. Her argument had not changed. Her evidence for it had, if anything, accumulated. The commercial infrastructure of Mother's Day had grown larger and more entrenched with each passing decade, exactly as she had predicted and objected to. She was not becoming unhinged. She was watching herself be proven right in a way that offered no satisfaction whatsoever. She gave the interviews because she still believed that if enough people understood what had happened, what had been done to her holiday, what had been taken from its original meaning, the public might demand something different. She never stopped believing the public could be persuaded. That belief, more than anything else, is what kept her writing and talking and showing up at conventions until the very end. By the late 1940s, Anna Jarvis was in her early 80s, partially blind and nearly deaf. She'd been moved into the Marshall Square Sanitarium in Westchester, Pennsylvania, not because she was mentally ill, but because she required care she could no longer provide for herself, and she could no longer afford private arrangements. Her financial situation was, at this point, genuinely dire. She'd spent most of her money on the campaign. What remained had gone to care for Elsinore and for herself. She received some support from friends and relatives, and, in one of history's more ironic footnotes, her bills at the sanitarium were quietly paid in part by the floral and greeting card industries, who had made fortunes from the holiday she'd spent decades trying to dismantle. If Anna knew this, which she may have, there is no record of what she thought about it. The Marshall Square Sanitarium was not a grim institution. It was a private facility in Westchester, which is a comfortable county seat west of Philadelphia. and Anna's care there was by most accounts adequate and dignified. She was not mistreated, she was not forgotten. Visitors came, journalists occasionally came to interview her, relatives checked in. But the circumstances of her arrival there tell you something true about what the campaign had cost. She was in her 80s, alone, almost without money, in a care facility she could not have afforded on her own, because she had spent 40 years and most of her inheritance fighting a battle she had lost. She was still mentally present, which is either comforting or terrible depending on how you look at it. She could still hold a conversation. She could still articulate her objections to commercial Mother's Day observance with clarity and force. She had not gone soft on the subject. If anything, she had more time to think about it than she had had during the active campaigning years, and thinking about it had not made her more reconciled to the outcome. She sat in the sanitarium and she was still angry about the greeting cards. Some things you do not make peace with. Her eyesight failing was a particular cruelty, given how much of her life had been organised around reading and writing. The letters had slowed, not because her convictions had softened, but because the physical act of writing had become difficult. She dictated when she could. She received visitors. She gave the occasional interview to the journalists who still found her worth writing about, which was fewer of them as the years went on. The world had moved on from Anna Jarvis in the way it moves on from figures who have made their contribution and passed their moment of maximum relevance. She was not forgotten. The newspapers still knew who she was. The history books noted her role, but she was no longer in the middle of anything. The campaign she'd run for 30 years had wound down not through any decisive defeat, but through the gradual exhaustion of resources and health. She had nothing left to spend and nowhere to go. The sanitarium was where people went when those things were true. She was still the founder of Mother's Day. That would not change. The second Sunday of May would keep coming. The florists would keep selling, and Anna Jarvis would lie in a Westchester sanitarium and find none of this acceptable. This is the detail that stops you. In the final years of her life, as Anna Jarvis sat in a Pennsylvania sanitarium, partially blind, nearly deaf, her fortune spent, her crusade lost. The floral industry that she had called pirates and racketeers was among the parties quietly covering her expenses. The precise arrangements are not entirely clear from the historical record, but the broad outlines are not disputed. The commercial interests she had spent decades fighting were, at the end, among the people keeping her alive. Whether this constitutes irony, justice, generosity, guilt, or some combination of all four is a question history leaves politely open. Anna, for her part, seems not to have made a public statement about it. By that point, she may not have known. Let's sit with this for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. Anna Jarvis had spent somewhere between 20 and 30 years publicly and loudly characterising the floral industry as thieves, bandits, and racketeers who had stolen her holiday and corrupted her mother's memory for commercial gain. She had picketed their conventions, she had filed lawsuits, she had given newspaper interviews calling them charlatans. She had done everything short of standing outside a flower shop with a sign, and she had probably considered that too. And the floral industry, in response to all of this, helped pay her nursing home bills when she could no longer pay them herself. There is a version of this story in which that is a genuinely compassionate act. An industry acknowledging quietly and without fanfare some moral responsibility toward the woman whose idea had made them so much money. There is another version in which it is the final, definitive expression of the power imbalance Anna had been fighting all along. They could afford to be generous because they had profited enormously from the things she'd given the world, and she could not afford anything because she had spent everything trying to get it back. Their generosity was funded by her loss. The money that covered her care came from the carnation sales she had spent decades trying to stop. There is a third version, which is simply that the people involved were human beings acting with ordinary decency toward an old woman who needed help, whatever their industry's history with her. The greeting card companies included. People are capable of compartmentalizing. You can profit from someone's work and also feel something genuine about their circumstances. These things coexist. What we do not know, and cannot know with certainty, is what Anna made of it. She was partially blind and nearly deaf by this point. The details of who was paying which bills may not have been fully communicated to her, or fully absorbed if they were. She may have known and chosen not to comment, which, given her history of commenting extensively on everything she found objectionable, might mean she found it too complicated to address. Or she may simply have not known and been cared for in decent ignorance of who was paying for it. History does not resolve this. It leaves Anna Jarvis in the sanitarium, in the care of an institution she could not have afforded, funded partly by the people she had spent her adult life fighting, and it does not tell us what she knew or felt about that arrangement, which is perhaps appropriate. The whole story of Anna Jarvis is a story about things that cannot be resolved cleanly, about love that cannot be preserved, meaning that cannot be protected, and legacies that escape the people who made them. The billing arrangements at the end are just the final version of the same problem she had been dealing with since 1915. Something she made was being managed by other people, and she had no control over it anymore. Here's a question worth sitting with. What would Anne Reeves Jarvis have made of all of this? The woman who ran civil, wore nursing clubs, who organised mothers across West Virginia around questions of sanitation and infant mortality, who closed a Sunday school lesson with a prayer for a memorial to all mothers. Would she have wanted a federal holiday? Would she have wanted the carnations and the brunches and the greeting cards? The historical record on Anne Reeves Jarvis is limited but suggestive. She was a practical woman. She was also a deeply community-minded one, someone who understood that collective ritual has value, that shared observance binds people together in ways that private feeling alone cannot. She might, in other words, have been perfectly fine with the holiday, which would have been its own kind of irony for Anna. Anne Reeves Jarvis left relatively little record of her own inner life. She was not a diarist, or if she was, the diaries have not survived. What we know of her comes largely through accounts of her public activities, the work clubs, the Friendship Day events, the Sunday school teaching, and through the way her daughter described her in letters and interviews over decades. In Anna's telling, Anne was a woman of principle, warmth, and extraordinary practical capability, a woman who saw a problem and organised around it, a woman whose love expressed itself through action. This description is useful for our question. Anne Reeves Jarvis, the practical organiser, the woman who ran public health campaigns and Civil War nursing operations, seems unlikely to have been precious about the mechanisms by which a good thing got done. If the greeting card reminded someone to call their mother, she might have considered that a satisfactory outcome. If the box of chocolates communicated love imperfectly but genuinely, she might have accepted imperfect and genuine as good enough. She'd spent her life working with what was available, not waiting for the ideal. There is also the matter of scale. Anne's prayer had been for a memorial for all mothers, not just the daughters of women exactly like herself, not just people with the emotional facility and the time to write personal letters, but all mothers everywhere. The commercial holiday, for all its inadequacies, reached all of those mothers. The florists sold flowers in every town in America. The greeting card arrived in mailboxes across the country. The Mother's Day brunch was served in restaurants that a personal letter could never reach. If the goal was for every mother to be acknowledged, the commercial holiday was doing it. Not in the way Anna wanted, but doing it. Anna's version of the holiday, the handwritten letter, the personal visit, the worn carnation, was a beautiful thing designed for people who had the time, the inclination, and the emotional directness to do it. Not everyone does. Anna Jarvis, who had spent her life working with actual communities of actual people, probably understood this better than her daughter. She had organised women who were exhausted, grieving, busy, poor, and pressed. She had worked with what they could give, not what she wished they could give. It is entirely possible, the evidence does not allow certainty, but it allows possibility that Anna Jarvis, watching from whatever vantage point the dead occupy, would have looked at Mother's Day as it actually existed and found it good enough. Not perfect, not what she would have specified, but good enough. A day when people thought about their mothers, spent time with them, sent something to say they mattered. Good enough is what practical people build toward. This possibility would have been cold comfort to Anna. She was not a good enough person. She was a perfect or nothing person, which is both her greatest quality and the source of most of her suffering. She loved her mother perfectly and completely, and she wanted the holiday to reflect that. The holiday reflected something messier and more human. Her mother might have been fine with that. Anna was not. While Anna was filing lawsuits and attending protest meetings in America, Mother's Day was quietly going global. Countries across Europe, Latin America, Asia, and beyond adopted some version of the holiday throughout the 20th century, often on different dates and with different cultural meanings attached. In the United Kingdom, Mothering Sunday, a much older tradition with roots in the 16th century, was eventually merged in popular culture with the American version. In Mexico, May 10th became a fixed Mother's Day date, observed with tremendous cultural weight. In Thailand, Mother's Day is celebrated on the birthday of the Queen. Anna had created something that replicated itself across cultures, adapting to local meanings in ways she'd never sanctioned or imagined. The holiday had, in a very real sense, escaped her entirely. The British situation is particularly instructive. Mothering Sunday had existed in England since at least the 16th century as a mid-Lent Sunday when people returned to their mother church, the cathedral or main church of their home parish, and by extension visited their families. Servants were given the day off to make the journey home. It was a religious observance that had acquired a family dimension over centuries, entirely independent of Anna Jarvis, entirely independent of white carnations, and predating the American holiday by roughly 350 years. When the American version arrived in British popular culture in the 20th century, it did not replace Mothering Sunday. It absorbed it. The two traditions merged into a single commercial and sentimental occasion on the fourth Sunday of Lent, and the florists and card companies arrived in Britain on essentially the same schedule they had kept in America. In Mexico, the holiday took on a weight and seriousness that arguably came closer to what Anna had intended than the American version ever did. May 10th, a fixed date, not a floating Sunday, is observed across Mexico with genuine cultural gravity. Families gather, serenades are organised. The day carries emotional significance that extends well beyond the retail transaction. Mexican Mother's Day is not primarily a greeting card occasion. It is a family event of real importance, observed with the directness and warmth that Anna, watching from her Philadelphia house in the 1930s, might have found closer to her original vision than anything happening in American department stores. The global spread happened largely without Anna's knowledge or involvement. She'd created the American holiday and fought for its federal recognition. She had not trademarked an idea, had not established an international organisation, had not coordinated with foreign governments or cultural bodies. The concept simply travelled, through American cultural influence, through immigration, through the natural human tendency to find in a neighbouring culture's practice something worth adopting and adapting. Each country that picked up Mother's Day changed it, reshaping it around local values, local family structures, local religious traditions, and local commercial interests. Anna had been very specific about the apostrophe, singular possessive, your Mother's Day. The global holiday that spread from her original act could not even be translated into many languages in a way that preserved that distinction. The singularity she had fought for in English was untranslatable into the plural fact of an international holiday observed by hundreds of millions of people in dozens of countries on multiple different dates. She'd made a thing for her mother. The world had made it into something for all mothers, everywhere, in whatever form fit the local culture. This is what ideas do when they escape. They stop belonging to the person who had them. They become something larger and less precise and more resilient than the original. Anna understood this as loss. The world experienced it as a holiday. If Anna had hoped the 1940s might deliver a more solemn, less commercial observance of Mother's Day, the Second World War offered a complicated version of that wish. Wartime Mother's Day carried genuine emotional weight. Sons overseas, Gold Star mothers at home, the holiday as a site of grief as much as celebration. Florists still sold flowers, card companies still sold cards. But the emotional register of the holiday shifted towards something heavier and more genuine, closer in spirit to what Anna had originally intended, even if the commercial apparatus remained intact. There is a certain grim satisfaction in this that Anna might have appreciated, had she been inclined to appreciate anything about the direction the holiday had taken, which by this point she largely was not. The Second World War changed the texture of Mother's Day in ways that were hard to separate from the general texture of wartime emotional life. When a significant portion of the adult male population is overseas, and when their mothers are at home waiting for letters and dreading telegrams, the second Sunday in May acquires a gravity it does not ordinarily carry. This was not the Mother's Day of department store sales and overcrowded restaurants. This was the Mother's Day of a woman sitting by a window with a letter from the Pacific that was already 2 weeks old, wondering if the address on the envelope was still accurate. The Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in combat, occupied a particular place in wartime American culture. Their grief was public, honoured, and impossible to sentimentalize entirely away. When you were buying carnations for your living mother in May of 1943, you were also aware, if you were paying any attention, that there were women for whom that particular May would be the first one with a white carnation instead of a red one. The distinction Anna had insisted on, white for mothers who had died, red for mothers still living, had been extended in the cultural logic of wartime to include a category she had not originally specified: mothers who were still living but whose children were not. The commercial apparatus did not stop. Hallmark still printed cards, florists still opened early, restaurants still took reservations. War does not halt retail. But the marketing shifted. The language in the advertisements became more earnest, the imagery more weighted with sacrifice and service, the implicit message less about brunch and more about gratitude of a specific and serious kind. Whether Anna noticed this shift or found it meaningful is not recorded. By the early 1940s, she was in her late 70s, her campaign largely exhausted, her energy diminished. She may have been past caring about the advertising copy. What the wartime holiday did accomplish, almost accidentally, was to create a version of Mother's Day that was about grief as much as celebration, about the specific, painful acknowledgement that some mothers had lost something irreplaceable in the service of a collective cause. This was not far from what Anna had always been trying to say. She had been saying, for 30 years, that the holiday should be about specific irreplaceable love, about the weight of what mothers give and what children owe them. The war made that argument viscerally, unavoidably real for an entire generation. Anna had been right all along about the emotional depth the holiday was capable of. She had simply never managed to make the commercial machinery stop long enough for anyone to feel it. The war did that temporarily, not through any reform she had advocated, but through a loss so large it overwhelmed the retail calendar for a few years. It was not the victory she had wanted. It was not quite nothing either. Anna Jarvis had been specific about the carnation from the beginning. White carnations for mothers who had died, red carnations for mothers who were living. She distributed them at the first service in 1908, and she intended them as a private emblem. Something you wore, not something you bought your mother. The carnation symbolism caught on, though it evolved in directions Anna didn't endorse. Florists sold them by the armload. The distinction between white and red became less consistent. Eventually, the carnation was partially displaced by roses, tulips, and whatever else the floral industry found convenient that particular spring. Anna, who had chosen the carnation for specific reasons tied to her specific mother, watched the symbol being generalized, mass-produced, and eventually somewhat sidelined, which is probably exactly as annoying as it sounds. Anne Reeves Jarvis had loved white carnation specifically. This was not a generalised preference for flowers. It was her flower, the one she grew, the one that appeared in her home, the one her daughter associated with her presence and her memory. When Anna chose the white carnation as the emblem for the first Mother's Day service, she was not selecting a visually appealing symbol from a menu of options. She was placing her mother's specific flower at the centre of the occasion. The carnation was Anne. To wear it was to carry Anne's memory in a way that was personal and unmistakable, at least to Anna, and she wanted everyone else to feel something of the same weight. The colour distinction mattered enormously to her. White for the dead, red for the living. This was not decoration. It was information. It told you something true about the person wearing it. A white carnation on your lapel said, "My mother is gone, and I am marking that today in public because her absence deserves to be named." A red carnation said, "She is here, she is living, and I am grateful enough to say so with this small visible emblem." It was the kind of symbol that required you to have thought about your actual situation, to have asked yourself which carnation applied to you and why, rather than simply purchasing the available colour. The floral industry had no particular investment in the colour distinction. Carnations were carnations. They came in white, red, pink, and various other shades, and florists stocked what sold. The fine distinctions Anna had drawn were not distinctions that translated into retail categories. Mother's Day flowers, Mother's Day carnations, these were the labels that mattered commercially. Whether the customer's mother was living or dead was not a field on the point-of-sale system. As the decades passed, the carnation's status as the official Mother's Day flower became less certain. Roses, always the dominant commercial flower, began appearing more frequently in Mother's Day marketing. Tulips, available in May, found their way into the arrangements. The carnation retained some cultural presence. Many people still associate it with the holiday, but its centrality had eroded. It had become one option among several rather than the emblem Anna had specified. She had chosen the carnation because it was her mother's. The industry had adopted it because it was available and identifiable. Once the industry found other flowers equally available and identifiable, the carnation's privileged position was negotiable. The symbol Anna had embedded with specific personal meaning had been adopted for generic commercial purposes and then partially replaced when something else came along. This is what happens to symbols when they enter commerce. They lose their specific gravity and become interchangeable with other symbols of roughly equivalent commercial utility. Anna knew this. She had been saying it since 1915. Nobody had listened then either. Even from the Marshall Square sanitarium, Anna Jarvis did not stop. She gave interviews when journalists came to visit. She issued statements. She maintained to the end that the holiday had been corrupted beyond recognition, and that the American public was celebrating something that bore almost no relationship to what she'd intended. The journalists who visited her in those final years described a woman who was frail, but mentally alert, still passionate, still certain she was right, still angry about the greeting cards. She was not a woman who made peace with things she disagreed with. This was perhaps her most consistent quality across 8 decades of life. The journalists who made the trip to Westchester in the mid to late 1940s found something they were not entirely expecting. Someone who had lost almost everything except her convictions, and who was in no way embarrassed by this. Anna Jarvis, in her early 80s, partially blind and nearly deaf, living in a sanitarium on other people's money, was not a broken person. She was a person who had decided what mattered and had not changed her mind. The frailty was physical. The position was intact. She talked about her mother. She talked about the original services in Grafton and Philadelphia. She talked about what the holiday was supposed to be, the handwritten letter, the personal visit, the white carnation worn as a private emblem. She talked about what it had become, the commercial event, the greeting card industry, the flowers sold by the gross at prices inflated for the occasion. The arguments were the same arguments she had been making for 30 years. They had not become less coherent with age. If anything, she made them more efficiently now, having had decades of practice. She was also by this point genuinely historical. The journalists who came to interview her were not just covering a consumer advocate with a grievance. They were interviewing the woman who had created Mother's Day, which had by then been a federal holiday for over 30 years, which had spread to countries around the world, which was observed annually by tens of millions of people. She'd made something that had outlasted her campaign, outlasted her money, outlasted her health, and would outlast her entirely. She was sitting in a sanitarium bed describing her objections to it, and the journalists were writing it down because the story was too strange not to record. She asked in some of these final interviews that people return to the original observance, write the letter, visit in person, wear the carnation, mean it. She was not asking for much. She was asking for the one thing that commerce could not provide and that no amount of retail pressure could replace: genuine, personal, specific attention to a specific person who had mattered to you. She had been asking for this since 1914. She was still asking at 82. Whether any of the people who read those final interviews sat down and wrote a letter to their mothers is not recorded. Probably some of them did. Probably most of them meant to and didn't, or sent a card instead, or made a reservation at a restaurant. This is the human condition. We know what the better thing is, and we do the easier thing, and we feel approximately fine about it. Anna Jarvis found this unacceptable her entire life, and found it unacceptable from her sanitarium bed. Still talking, still right, still not listened to. She gave her last interviews in a facility she could not have afforded, about a holiday she'd not wanted, making arguments that would not be acted on. She was consistent to the end. It is the least glamorous form of integrity, and also, perhaps, the most genuine. Anna Jarvis died on November 24, 1948, at the Marshall Square Sanitarium in Westchester, Pennsylvania. She was 84 years old. She was buried in West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, next to her mother Anne and her sister Elsinore, the 3 Jarvis women together at the end, as they had been at the beginning. She left almost no money. She left no children. She left no organisation continuing her work. She left a holiday she'd created, then tried to destroy, that had by then become one of the most commercially successful days on the American retail calendar. Mother's Day did not pause to observe her passing. The following May, the florists were ready. The death was quiet, as deaths in sanitariums tend to be. There was no deathbed scene of particular drama, no final statement recorded for history, no last letter to a congressman objecting to the greeting card industry. She'd said everything she had to say, repeatedly and at length, over the course of 4 decades. By the end, she was too ill to say much of anything. The woman who had written more letters than most people read in a lifetime fell silent the way fires do, not all at once but gradually, the light and heat diminishing over a period of time until one morning there was simply none left. The newspapers ran obituaries. They were respectful. They noted her role in creating the holiday, noted the irony of her subsequent campaign against it, described her in terms that were warm without being entirely clear-eyed about the cost of what she had done. The Associated Press ran a piece. Several major papers followed. She was not forgotten in death. She had been too singular a figure for that. The woman who had created Mother's Day and spent 30 years trying to uncreate, it was simply too good a story to let pass without acknowledgement. The burial at West Laurel Hill placed her next to Anne and Elsinore, which was exactly right. The 3 women who had organised the better part of Anna's emotional life were together again in the Pennsylvania earth. Anne, who had offered the prayer that started everything. Elsinore, who had shared the house and the campaign and the dwindling money. And Anna, who had answered the prayer and spent everything answering it. Whatever they would have said to each other, in whatever conversation the dead conduct among themselves, is not available to us. What remained above ground was the holiday, still running, still commercially observed, still generating revenue for the floral and greeting card industries that Anna had called bandits, still sending people to restaurants on the second Sunday of May, still prompting the phone calls and the cards and the occasional handwritten letter from someone who had read about Anna Jarvis and decided to do it the way she had asked. She did not win. She also did not entirely lose, because the holiday she had wanted to preserve, the personal, specific, handwritten version of it, still happens. It happens inside the commercial holiday, quietly, in the letters people do occasionally write, and the visits people do occasionally make, and the moments when someone stops long enough to think specifically about their mother and say something true about what she had meant. Anna could not protect that version of the holiday. She could not stop the other version from growing up around it. But the thing she had wanted to preserve was never entirely extinguished. She had made it. It had cost her everything. It is still here. Here is what Anna Jarvis actually gave the world, whatever she intended, a specific, named, recurring occasion for people to think about their mothers, to call them, to visit them, to send something, even a purchased card, even a box of chocolates you would have despised, to say at least once a year with cultural reinforcement behind them that this person mattered. The holiday does not do what Anna wanted it to do. It has never done what Anna wanted it to do, but it does something. In the year since her death, researchers have consistently found that Mother's Day is among the highest volume days for telephone calls, for family visits, for expressions of affection that might not otherwise have been made. Anna wanted a personal letter in your own handwriting. The world gives its mothers a phone call and a restaurant reservation. It is not what she asked for. It is not nothing. The phone calls matter more than they look like they matter. Think about what they actually are. An adult child on a specific day, taking a specific action that says, out loud to a real person, I thought of you today. You are worth a phone call. You exist in my mind as someone important. This is not the handwritten letter Anna wanted. But it is not the purchased card either, precisely. It is direct. It is personal. It is your voice and your mother's voice, specific to each other, saying things that only the two of you know how to say in the way that you say them. The visits are real too. The second Sunday in May generates a measurable increase in cross-country travel, in adult children going home, in families sitting down together who would not have sat down together that particular weekend without the cultural reminder. Some of these gatherings are awkward. Some of them surface old tensions and produce new ones. Some of them are lovely. All of them are real people in the same room together, doing the thing that Anna had always said was the point, even if they arrived via a restaurant reservation rather than a Sunday church service. Anna's actual legacy is not the greeting card. It is not the flowers or the brunch or the hallmark section at the pharmacy. Her actual legacy is the existence of the day itself, the fact that there is, on the calendar, a named recurring occasion that gives people permission and structure and cultural pressure to do something they already want to do but might not do without the reminder. Most adults love their mothers. Many of them are not good at saying so. The holiday is the mechanism that makes them try, once a year, to bridge the gap between what they feel and what they express. Anna had tried to make that mechanism personal and specific from the beginning. The world made it commercial and general. The commercial and general version has reached hundreds of millions of people who would never have found the personal and specific version on their own. This is not what she wanted. It is in some measure what she was after. She'd watched her mother close a Sunday school lesson with a prayer that someone would create a memorial for all mothers. She had spent 63 years answering that prayer. The answer was imperfect, commercialized, fought over, despised by its creator, and observed annually by hundreds of millions of people in dozens of countries. Anna Jarvis had hoped someone would do something. Anna had done something entirely. It was messier and larger and less controlled than either of them could have imagined. It is the second Sunday in May. Somewhere a florist is opening early. Somewhere a greeting card is being selected from a rack. And somewhere, probably in more places than Anna ever believed, someone is sitting down to write a letter. The question Anna Jarvis spent her life screaming about is actually worth taking seriously for a moment. Does commercialization ruin a holiday? There is a reasonable argument that it does, that when feeling becomes transactional, when love is expressed through a purchased product rather than a personal act, something genuine is lost. There's also a reasonable argument that commerce and sentiment are not mutually exclusive, that the flower you buy your mother is not rendered meaningless by the fact that a florist sold it to you, and that ritual, even commercially mediated ritual, serves real human needs for connection and acknowledgement. Anna was firmly in the first camp. Most of the greeting card industry was firmly in the second. Most people, if you pressed them, probably land somewhere in the guilty middle. The case against commercialization goes something like this. When you purchase a card, you are outsourcing the emotional labor. Someone else found the words, someone else chose the image, someone else determined that this combination of sentiment and color scheme would be broadly acceptable to a wide demographic of people expressing appreciation for a parent. You selected it from a rack, which is a curation task rather than a creative one, and you signed your name, which is the absolute minimum personal contribution the transaction allows. The card says something. You didn't say it. You ratified it. These are different acts, and the difference matters. The case for commerce goes something like this. Not everyone has the emotional vocabulary, or the time or the comfort with vulnerability that the handwritten letter requires. The card lowers the barrier enough that someone who would otherwise say nothing says something. Something is better than nothing. The flower delivered by a florist to a woman who lives alone on a Sunday afternoon says, "Someone thought of you." The thinking happened first. The commerce was just the delivery mechanism. The love was real before the transaction occurred. Both of these arguments are true, which is why the question does not resolve cleanly. Commerce does something to the feeling it packages. It standardizes it, makes it generic, removes the specific difficulty that gives genuine expression its weight, At the same time, the feeling existed before the commerce, and the commerce reaches people who would otherwise not express it at all. You're choosing between pure expression that reaches few people and impure expression that reaches many. Anna chose purity. The market chose reach. The market won the argument in practice. Anna may have won it in principle. What is perhaps most interesting about the hallmark question is how it has evolved. In the decade since Anna's death, the critique of commercial holidays has become a genuinely mainstream cultural conversation. People discuss the commodification of Christmas, of Valentine's Day, of Mother's Day itself, in terms that would be recognisable to Anna Jarvis. The argument she was making in 1915 is an argument people are still making. It has not resolved. It has simply become ambient, a background hum of cultural discomfort with the gap between feeling and transaction that nobody has yet found a satisfying way to close. Anna was not ahead of her time, exactly. She was of her time in every important way. But the problem she identified has not gone away, and the solution she proposed, mean it, write it yourself, make it personal, has not been improved upon by anything the greeting card industry has produced in the century since. She was right about what mattered. She was wrong to think it could be protected. Those two things coexist without resolving each other, the way the best arguments tend to. Anna Jarvis was particular about the apostrophe. Mother's Day, singular possessive, because it was your Mother's Day, not a collective celebration of all mothers in the abstract. She believed this distinction mattered enormously. It was the difference between a personal act of remembrance and a generic civic occasion. When organisations began writing it as Mother's Day, plural possessive, belonging to all mothers collectively, she objected in writing. When it became simply Mother's Day in common usage, she objected to that too, though the singular possessive had at least survived. The apostrophe wars are a small thing to fight about. They are also, on reflection, not really about the apostrophe. They are about whether the holiday belonged to a specific feeling or to a commercial category. That was the real argument. The punctuation was just where it showed up on paper. To understand why Anna cared so much about a single punctuation mark, you have to understand what she believed about the relationship between language and meaning. She was not a pedant for pedantry's sake. She had spent years articulating a specific vision of the holiday, and the apostrophe was the point where that vision was either honoured or abandoned in a single typographical choice. Mother's Day, your mother specifically, the woman you grew up with, whose particular face and voice and smell of cooking you carry with you, required the singular possessive. The day belonged to that person. It was for her and about your relationship with her. Mother's Day, all mothers, collectively, as a demographic category, as a social institution, as a commercial target, required the plural possessive. And the plural possessive was, to Anna, the moment at which the holiday stopped being about a person and started being about a market. The minute you pluralized it, you had abstracted away from the specific. You were no longer honouring your mother. You were observing a designated appreciation period for the category of motherhood. These were genuinely different things, and Anna, who had been specific from the beginning, found the difference intolerable. She wrote letters about the apostrophe. This sounds absurd, and it is also entirely consistent with the rest of her campaign. If you believe the specific is what matters, then every erosion of specificity is worth fighting, including the typographical ones. A battle you can win with a letter about punctuation is at least a battle you can potentially win. The lawsuits against the confectionery industry were not battles she could win. The apostrophe was at least legible as a discrete correctable error. She did not win the apostrophe either, in any durable sense. Usage varies to this day. Different publications, different organisations, different countries use different forms. The singular possessive survives in enough context that the distinction has not been entirely lost, which is probably more than Anna could have hoped for by the time she was arguing about it from a sanitarium bed. But the plural version exists everywhere she would have objected to it, on signs and cards and government documents, turning her specific personal holiday into a category label. The apostrophe was the smallest possible version of the argument she'd been making since 1915. Commerce generalizes, meaning requires specificity. Every time the holiday scaled up, it became less about any particular mother and more about the idea of mothers. Anna had made it for a particular mother. The world had made it for all of them. The apostrophe was where you could see the difference if you knew to look. She knew to look, she always had. There is something both admirable and melancholy about Anna Jarvis in her final years. She'd been right about something important, that commodification empties meaning, that the personal cannot survive indefinite scaling, that a holiday designed for a specific kind of feeling becomes a different thing when it becomes an industry. She'd been saying this for decades, clearly and consistently, and no one with any power to act on it had listened. She ended her life in a sanitarium, partially blind, nearly broke, still certain she was right. History has not entirely disagreed with her, but history also did not give her what she wanted. It rarely does. She had given the world a holiday. The world had given her a lesson about what happens when you give things to the world. The sanitarium years, the last several years of her life in Westchester, have a particular quality in retrospect. She was not suffering in any dramatic sense. She was not mistreated, not forgotten, not abandoned by everyone who had ever known her. People visited, journalists came, relatives kept in touch. She was cared for, fed, housed, and kept reasonably comfortable. By the material standards of old age in 1940s America, her situation was not dire. What it was quiet. After decades of campaigns and letters and lawsuits and convention disruptions and newspaper interviews, the silence of those final years was its own kind of statement. Not a chosen silence. Anna had not decided to stop speaking. The world had simply stopped providing the occasions and the audiences that had structured her public life. There were no more conventions to disrupt. There were no more lawsuits she could afford to file. The newspapers still came occasionally, but occasional is not the same as the constant engaged battle she'd been fighting for 30 years. The campaign had wound, down, and what was left was an old woman in a bed with her convictions and the approaching end. She'd been alone in the deepest sense for a long time by then. Elsinore was gone. Her mother had been gone for 40 years. The movement she'd tried to build had never really cohered into anything beyond herself. There was no organisation, no successor, no one to carry on the work. The work had always been just Anna, writing letters and showing up at meetings and filing suits and talking to journalists. When Anna could no longer do those things, the work stopped. What she had in those final years was certainty. Not the cold certainty of someone who has given up caring, but the warm certainty of someone who has thought carefully about something for a very long time and knows exactly where they stand. She knew what the holiday had been meant to be. She knew what it had become. She knew the difference mattered. She had said so clearly for 30 years, and she would say so to anyone who came to ask from her sanitarium bed, with whatever voice she had left. This is not nothing. There is a kind of dignity in being absolutely clear about what you believe until the very end, even when the belief has cost you everything and changed nothing. Anna Jarvis was not a winner by any ordinary measure. She was something rarer, a person who knew exactly what she thought, said it consistently, paid the full price for it, and never confused the cost with a reason to change her mind. She was right about what mattered. She was in the sanitarium anyway. She would have said these things were not related. Every year on the second Sunday of May, the date Anna chose, the date that was written into federal law at her insistence, something happens across the country and across much of the world. People call their mothers, people visit, people sit at tables in crowded restaurants and eat eggs Benedict and feel, underneath the awkwardness and the obligation, and the Hallmark card someone picked up at the pharmacy, something genuine. A recognition that the person across from them or on the other end of the phone is specific and irreplaceable, that they will not always be there, that saying so matters. Anna Jarvis did not want this version of the holiday. She wanted something quieter, more personal, more direct. But she did want people to think about their mothers with intention and gratitude once a year, on the second Sunday of May. And improbably, commercially, imperfectly, they do. You are, right now, closer to the next Mother's Day than you are to the last one, or the reverse, depending on when you're listening to this. Either way it is coming. It is always coming. Anna locked it into the federal calendar in 1914, and it has arrived every year since without exception, through wars and recessions and a global pandemic, and every other thing the 20th and 21st centuries have produced. The second Sunday of May, every year, no exceptions. Florists are already thinking about it. Greeting card sections are already being planned. Restaurant reservation systems will fill up. The commercial apparatus Anna spent her life fighting will run its full seasonal cycle, as it does every year, as it will continue to do long after everyone listening to this has forgotten the name Anna Jarvis entirely. And inside all of that, inside the retail event, inside the crowded restaurant, inside the card selected from the rack at the pharmacy, something else is also happening. Someone is sitting with their mother and noticing, maybe for the first time in months, how she holds her coffee cup, or the specific way she laughs at something the grandchildren said. Someone is on the phone with a mother they haven't spoken to in too long, saying things they mean, because the date on the calendar gave them the push they needed. Someone is standing at a graveside with white carnations, the right colour, the one Anna specified, the one for mothers who have died, and standing there quietly for a few minutes in the kind of acknowledgement that does not require an audience. These moments exist. They happen every second Sunday of May, in addition to the brunches and the cards and the elevated carnation prices. They are the thing Anna was trying to protect, and she could not protect them from commerce, but commerce could not destroy them either. They are too personal and too specific and too human to be entirely absorbed by a retail event. They persist inside the holiday the way the original meaning of anything persists inside the cultural forms that have grown up around it. Smaller than it used to be, harder to find, but there. Anne Reeves Jarvis closed a Sunday school lesson with a prayer. Her daughter spent 60 years answering it. The answer was imperfect and commercial and fought over and despised by the person who gave it, and it reaches hundreds of millions of people every year. And somewhere inside it, on the second Sunday of May, people stop and think about their mothers with something genuine. That is not what Anna wanted. It is not nothing. And it is, let's be honest with ourselves, here in the quiet, probably more than most of us deserve, given how rarely we write the letter. Put down the phone tonight. Write the letter. She asked so many times. So tonight, here you are. Clean sheets, soft pillow, a roof that doesn't leak straw onto your face, and a mother who, if she's still living, you could call tomorrow. Or today. Or right now, if the hour isn't too unreasonable, which it probably is. Because it is always an unreasonable hour when you're listening to this channel. Anna Jarvis died in a sanitarium with almost nothing. No money, no children, no organisation carrying on her work, no victory she could point to and call complete. She had given everything she had, her inheritance, her time, her health, the decades of her middle and old age, to a holiday that had stopped listening to her almost before it started. She'd wanted something quiet and personal and specific. She'd gotten something enormous and commercial and generic. She'd spent 30 years trying to fix it and run out of everything before she could. And yet, every second Sunday in May, something she made is still running, still bringing people to tables with their mothers, still prompting the phone calls that wouldn't otherwise happen, still giving people the cultural permission to say, out loud to a specific person, "You mattered to me. You shaped me." I do not say this enough, and I am saying it today because there is a day for it, and the day exists because a woman in West Virginia sat in a Sunday school classroom and heard her mother's prayer and decided she would be the one to answer it. That woman never had children. She never had grandchildren. She never sat at the crowded restaurant on the second Sunday of May being thanked. She was always on the giving end, never the receiving end, right up until the very end. She poured everything into a memorial for her mother and watched the world turn it into a Hallmark display, and she was furious about it, and she was right to be, and the holiday outlived her anyway and kept doing what it was doing and keeps doing it still. History is full of people who made things they couldn't control, who gave the world gifts that the world immediately repurposed into something they hadn't intended. Anna Jarvis is one of the more vivid examples. She is also, if you are paying attention, a reminder of something worth sitting with tonight. The people who made things for love, who paid prices they did not expect, who were right about what mattered even when the world was not particularly interested in their being right. Anne Reeves Jarvis ran nursing clubs during a civil war. She nursed boys from both sides because they were boys and they were wounded, and that was enough. She organised mothers around contaminated milk and dirty water because children were dying and someone had to do something. She closed a Sunday school lesson with a prayer for a memorial that did not yet exist, and her daughter heard it, and the daughter spent her entire life trying to build it. The three of them are buried together in Pennsylvania, Anne and Elsinore and Anna, the women who started it all, side by side, a few miles from the city where the letters were written and the campaign was run and the money ran out. Somewhere tonight, on a refrigerator or in a drawer, there might be a card your mother kept, or a voicemail she saved, or a photograph from a second Sunday in May when everyone managed to be in the same place at the same time and someone thought to take a picture. Anna wanted you to write the letter. She asked for 60 years. Maybe this weekend you do. Sleep well.